The Other Wise Man by Henry van Dyke. In the days when Augustus Caesar was master of many kings and Herod reigned in Jerusalem, there lived in the city of Ecbatana, in the mountains of Persia, a certain Artaban, the Median. From the roof of his house he could look over the rising battlements of the 7 walls encircling the royal treasury, to the hill where the summer palace of the Parthian emperors glittered like a jewel in a crown. Around the dwelling of Artaban spread a fair garden, a tangle of flowers and fruit trees, watered by streams descending from the slopes of Mount Orontes, and made musical by innumerable birds. But in the soft, odorous darkness of the late September night, all sounds were hushed, save the splashing of water. High above the trees a dim glow of light shone through the curtained arches of the upper chamber, where the master of the house was holding counsel with his friends. He was a tall, dark man of about 40 years, with brilliant eyes set near together under his broad brow, and firm lines graven around his fine, thin lips. The brow of a dreamer, and the mouth of a soldier, a man of sensitive feeling, but inflexible will, one of those born for a life of quest. His robe was of pure white wool, thrown over a tunic of silk, and a white, pointed cap rested on his flowing black hair. It was the dress of the ancient priesthood of the Magi, called the fire worshippers. "Welcome," he said, in his low, pleasant voice, as one after another entered the room. "You are all welcome, and this house grows bright with the joy of your presence." There were 9 men, differing in age, but alike in the richness of their dress of many-colored silks, in the massive golden collars around their necks marking them as Parthian nobles, and in the winged circles of gold resting upon their breasts, the sign of the followers of Zoroaster. They took their places around a black altar where a tiny flame burned. Artaban, standing beside it, and waving a barsom of thin tamarisk branches above the fire, fed it with dry sticks of pine and fragrant oils. Then he began the ancient chant, and the voices of his companions joined in the beautiful hymn to Ahura Mazda. "We worship the divine spirit, all wisdom and goodness possessing." The fire rose with the chant, throbbing as if made of musical flame, until it illuminated the whole apartment. The floor was laid with tiles of dark blue veined with white. Pilasters of twisted silver stood out against the blue walls. The clerestory of round-arched windows above was hung with azure silk. The vaulted ceiling was a pavement of sapphires, like the body of heaven in its clearness, sown with silver stars. In effect, the room was like a quiet, starry night, flushed in the east with rosy promise of the dawn. As the house of a man should, it expressed the character and spirit of the master. When the song ended, Artaban invited his friends to be seated, and said, "You have come tonight at my call as faithful scholars of Zoroaster, to renew your faith in the God of purity, even as this fire has been rekindled on the altar. We worship not the fire, but him of whom it is the chosen symbol, because it is the purest of all created things. It speaks to us of one who is light and truth. Is it not so, my father?" "It is well said, my son," answered the venerable Abgarus. "The enlightened are never idolaters. They lift the veil of form and go into the shrine of reality." "Hear me then, my father and my friends," said Artaban. "We have searched the secrets of nature together, and studied the healing virtues of water and fire and the plants. We have read also the books of prophecy in which the future is dimly foretold. But the highest of all learning is the knowledge of the stars. To trace their courses is to untangle the threads of the mystery of life from beginning to end. But is not our knowledge of them still incomplete? Are there not many stars still beyond our horizon, lights known only to the dwellers in the far southland, among the spice trees of Punt and the gold mines of Ophir?" There was a murmur of assent. "The stars," said Tigranes, "are the thoughts of the eternal. They are numberless. The wisdom of the Magi is the greatest of all wisdoms on earth because it knows its own ignorance. And that is the secret of power. We keep men always looking for a new sunrise, but we ourselves know that the darkness is equal to the light, that the conflict between them will never be ended. That does not satisfy me, answered Artaban. For if the waiting must be endless and unfulfilled, then it would not be wisdom to look and wait. The new sunrise will certainly dawn in the appointed time. Do not our own books tell us that men will see the brightness of a great light? That is true, said Abgarus. Every faithful disciple of Zoroaster knows the prophecy. In that day Sosiash the victorious shall arise out of the prophets. Around him shall shine a mighty brightness. He shall make life everlasting, incorruptible, and immortal, and the dead shall rise again. My father, said Artaban, with a glow on his face, I have carried this prophecy in the secret place of my soul. Religion without a great hope would be like an altar without a living fire. And I have read the other words which speak yet more clearly of this. He drew from his tunic 2 small rolls of fine linen with writing upon them. Long before our fathers came into the land of Babylon, there were wise men in Chaldea, from whom the first of the Magi learned the secret of the heavens. And of these Balaam was one of the mightiest. Hear the words of his prophecy. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Judah was a captive by the waters of Babylon, said Tigranes with contempt, and the sons of Jacob were in bondage to our kings. The tribes of Israel are scattered through the mountains like lost sheep. From the remnant that swells in Judea under the yoke of Rome, neither star nor scepter shall arise. And yet, answered Artaban, it was the Hebrew Daniel who was the most honored of our great King Cyrus. A sure prophet and a reader of the thoughts of God, Daniel proved himself to our people. And he wrote, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. But, my son, said Abgarus, these are mystical numbers. Who can unlock their meaning? Artaban answered, My 3 companions among the Magi, Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, and I have searched the ancient tablets of Chaldea and computed the time. It falls in this year. We have studied the sky, and in the spring of the year we saw 2 of the greatest stars draw near together in the sign of the fish, which is the house of the Hebrews. We also saw a new star there, which shone for 1 night and vanished. Now again the 2 great planets are meeting. This night is their conjunction. My 3 brothers are watching at the ancient temple of the 7 spheres at Borsippa in Babylonia, and I am watching here. If the star shines again, in 10 days we will set out together for Jerusalem, to see and worship the promised one who shall be born, King of Israel. I believe the sign will come. I have made ready for the journey. I have sold my house and my possessions, and bought these jewels, a sapphire, a ruby, and a pearl, to carry as tribute to the king. And I ask you to go with me on the pilgrimage that we may together find the prince. From the inmost fold of his girdle he drew out the 3 great gems, one blue as a fragment of the night sky, one redder than a ray of sunrise, one pure as the peak of a snow mountain at twilight. But a veil of doubt and mistrust came over his friends' faces, like a fog creeping up from the marshes to hide the hills. Artaban, this is a vain dream, Tigranes said. It comes from too much looking upon the stars and the cherishing of lofty thoughts. No king will ever rise from the broken race of Israel, and no end will ever come to the eternal strife of light and darkness. He who looks for it is a chaser of shadows. Farewell. Each of the others, in turn, said the quest was not for him. But Abgarus, The oldest, who lingered after the others had gone, said gravely, "My son, it may be that the light of truth is in this sign that has appeared in the skies. Or it may be that it is only a shadow of the light, as Tigranes has said. But better to follow even the shadow of the best than to remain content with the worst. And those who would see wonderful things must often be ready to travel alone. I am too old for this journey, but my heart shall be a companion of the pilgrimage. Go in peace." So, Artaban was left in solitude. For a long time he watched the flame that flickered upon the altar. Then he walked to the roof terrace. The cool wind that heralds daybreak was drawing downward from Mount Orontes. Birds, half awakened, chirped among the rustling leaves, and the smell of ripened grapes came in brief wafts from the arbors. Far over the eastern plain a white mist stretched like a lake, but where the distant peaks of Zagros serrated the western horizon, the sky was clear. Jupiter and Saturn rolled together like drops of lambent flame about to blend into one. As Artaban watched them, behold, an azure spark was born out of the darkness beneath, rounding itself with purple splendors to a crimson sphere, then spiring upward through rays of saffron and orange into a point of white radiance, tiny and infinitely remote, yet perfect in every part. It pulsated as if the Magian's own 3 jewels had mingled and been transformed into a living heart of light. He bowed his head. "It is the sign," he said. "The king is coming, and I will go to meet him." By the waters of Babylon. All night long Vazda, the swiftest of Artaban's horses, had been waiting, saddled and bridled in her stall, pawing the ground impatiently and shaking her bit. Before the birds had fully roused to their high, joyful chant of morning song, before the mist had begun to lift lazily from the plain, the other wise man was in the saddle, riding swiftly westward. How close, how intimate is the comradeship between a man and his favorite horse on a long journey. They drink at the same spring, sleep under the same guardian stars. The master shares his meal with his hungry companion, and feels the soft lips caressing his palm as they close over the morsel of bread. In the gray dawn he is roused by the gentle stir of a warm breath over his sleeping face, and looks up into the eyes of his faithful fellow traveler, ready for the toil of the day. And then, through the keen morning air, the swift hoofbeats their spirited music along the road, keeping time to the pulsing of 2 hearts. Artaban must indeed ride wisely and well to keep the appointed hour with the other magi. For the route was 150 parsangs, and 15 was the utmost he could travel in a day. But he pushed forward, making the fixed distance every day, though he must travel late into the night, and in the morning long before sunrise. He passed along the brown slopes of Mount Orontes, furrowed by the rocky courses of 100 torrents. He crossed the level plains of the Nisakans, where the famous herds of horses tossed their heads at Vazda's approach, and galloped away with the thunder of many hoofs. He traversed the fertile fields of Concobar, where the dust from the threshing floors filled the air with a golden mist, half hiding the huge temple of Astarte with its 400 pillars. At Bahistan, among the rich gardens watered by fountains from the rock, he looked up at the mountain thrusting its immense rugged brow out over the road, and saw the figure of King Darius trampling upon his fallen foe, and the proud list of his conquests graven high on the face of the eternal cliff. Over many a cold and desolate pass, crawling painfully across the wind-swept shoulders of the hills, down many a black mountain gorge, where the river roared and raced before him like a savage guide, through the oak groves of Kareen and the dark gates of Zagros, walled in by precipices, over the broad rice fields where autumnal vapors spread their deathly mists, following the river Gindes, under tremulous shadows of poplar and tamarind, and out upon the flat plain where the road ran straight as an arrow through the stubble fields and parched meadows, across the swirling floods of Tigris and the many channels of Euphrates. Artaban pressed onward until he arrived, at nightfall on the 10th day, beneath the shattered walls of populous Babylon. He would gladly have turned into the city to find rest and refreshment for himself and Vazda, but it was 3 hours' journey yet to the Temple of the Seven Spheres, and he must reach the place by midnight if he would find his comrades waiting. So he rode steadily on. A grove of date palms made an island of gloom in the pale yellow sea of stubble fields. The grove was close and silent as the tomb. Scenting some danger, Vazda picked her way delicately, carrying her head low. At last she gave a quick breath of anxiety and stood stock still, quivering in every muscle, before a dark object in the shadow of the last palm tree. Artaban dismounted. The dim starlight revealed the form of a man lying across the road, one of the poor Hebrew exiles who still dwelt in great numbers in the vicinity. His skin, dry and yellow as parchment, bore the mark of the deadly fever which ravaged the marshlands in autumn. The chill of death was in his lean hand, and when released the arm fell back inertly. Artaban turned away with a thought of pity, consigning the body to that burial the Magians deemed most fitting, the funeral of the desert, from which the kites and vultures rise on dark wings, and the beasts of prey slink furtively away, leaving only white bones in the sand. But as he turned, a ghostly sigh came from the man's lips. The bony fingers closed convulsively on the Magian's robe and held him fast. Artaban's spirit throbbed with a dumb resentment. What claim had this unknown fragment of human life upon his compassion or his service? If he lingered but for an hour, he could hardly reach Borsippa at the appointed time. His companions would go without him. Should he turn aside from the following of the star? Risk the great reward of his divine faith to give a cup of cold water to a poor, perishing Hebrew? God of truth and purity, he prayed, direct me in the holy path, the way of wisdom, which thou only knowest. Then Artaban turned back to the sick man. Carrying him to the foot of the palm tree, he brought water and moistened the sufferer's brow and breath. He mingled a draught of one of those simple but potent remedies he carried always in his girdle, for the Magians were skillful physicians as well as astrologers, and poured it slowly between the colorless lips. Hour after hour he labored, and at last the man's strength returned. He sat up and looked about him. "Who art thou?" he said. "I am Artaban the Magian, and I am going to Jerusalem in search of one who is to be born a great prince and deliverer of all men. I dare not delay any longer. But see, here is all I have left of bread and wine, and a potion of healing herbs." The Jew raised his trembling hand solemnly to heaven. "May the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob bless and prosper the journey of the merciful. I have nothing to give thee in return, only this, that our prophets have said the Messiah should be born not in Jerusalem, but in Bethlehem of Judah. May the Lord bring thee in peace and safety to that place." It was already long past midnight. Artaban rode in haste, and Vazda flew over the ground like a gazelle. But the first beam of the sun sent her shadow before her as she entered upon the final stadium of the journey. And Artaban, anxiously scanning the great mound of Nimrod and the Temple of the Seven Spheres, could discern no trace of his friends. Artaban dismounted and climbed to the highest terrace, looking toward the west. The huge desolation of the marshes stretched away to the horizon and the border of the desert, but there was no sign of the caravan of the wise men, far or near. At the terrace edge he saw a cairn of broken bricks, and under them a piece of parchment. He read, "We can delay no longer. We go to find the king. Follow us across the desert." Artaban sat down and covered his head in despair. "How can I cross the desert?" said he. "With no food and with a spent horse. I must return to Babylon, sell my sapphire and buy a train of camels and provision for the journey. Only God the Merciful knows whether I shall not lose the sight of the king because I tarried to show mercy." For the sake of a little child. There was silence in the Hall of Dreams, and through this silence I saw, but very dimly, the other wise man's figure passing over the dreary undulations of the desert, high upon the back of his camel, rocking steadily onward like a ship over the waves. The land of death spread its cruel net around him. The stony wastes bore no fruit but briars and thorns. Arid and inhospitable mountain ranges rose before him. Shifting hills of treacherous sand were heaped like tombs along the horizon. By day, the fierce heat pressed its intolerable burden on the quivering air, and no living creature moved but tiny jerboas, scuttling through the parched bushes, or lizards vanishing in the clefts of the rock. By night, jackals barked in the distance, while a blighting chill followed the fever of the day. Through heat and cold, the Magian moved on. Then I saw the gardens and orchards of Damascus, watered by the streams of Abana and Pharpar. I saw the long snowy ridge of Hermon, the dark groves of cedars, the valley of the Jordan, the blue waters of the Lake of Galilee, and, far beyond, the highlands of Judah. Through all these Artaban moved steadily onward until he arrived at Bethlehem, bearing his ruby and his pearl to offer to the king. "For now at last," he said, "I shall surely find him, though it be alone and later than my brethren." The streets of the village seemed deserted. From the open door of a low stone cottage, Artaban heard the sound of a woman's voice singing softly. He entered, and found a young mother hushing her baby to rest. She told him of the strangers from the Far East who had appeared in the village 3 days ago. They said that a star had guided them to the place where Joseph of Nazareth was lodging with his wife Mary and her newborn child, Jesus, and how they had paid reverence to the child and laid gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh at his feet. But the travelers disappeared again, as suddenly as they had come. We were afraid at the strangeness of their visit. The family from Nazareth fled that same night secretly, and it was whispered that they were going far away to Egypt. Ever since, something evil hangs over our village. They say Roman soldiers are coming from Jerusalem to force a new tax from us, and the men have hidden themselves to escape it." The child in her arms looked up in Artaban's face and smiled, stretching out its rosy hands to him. His heart warmed to the touch. Might not this child have been the promised prince? He asked himself. Kings have been born in lowlier houses than this. The favorite of the stars may rise even from a cottage. But no, it has not seemed good to the God of wisdom to reward my search so easily. The one I seek has gone before me, and now I must follow the king to Egypt. The young mother laid the babe in its cradle, and set food before the strange guest that fate had brought into her house. It was the plain fare of peasants, but willingly offered, and therefore full of refreshment for the soul as well as for the body. As Artaban ate, the child fell into a happy slumber, and murmured sweetly in its dreams. But suddenly there came the noise of a wild confusion in the streets, a shrieking and wailing of women's voices, a clangor of trumpets, and a desperate cry, "Soldiers! The soldiers of Herod! They are killing our children!" White with terror, the mother crouched motionless in the darkest corner of the room, covering her child with the folds of her robe, lest he wake and cry. But Artaban went and stood in the doorway of the house, his broad shoulders filling the portal from side to side. At the sight of the imposing stranger, the soldiers with bloody hands and dripping swords hesitated. The captain approached to thrust him aside, but Artaban's face was as calm as though he were watching the stars, and in his eyes burned that steady radiance before which even the half-tamed hunting leopard shrinks. He held the soldier silently for an instant, and then said in a low voice, "I am alone in this place, and waiting to give this jewel to the prudent captain who will leave me in peace." He showed the ruby, glistening in his hand like a great drop of blood. The pupils of the captain's eyes expanded with desire, and he stretched out his hand for the ruby. "March on!" he cried to his men. "There is no child here." As the clamor and clang of arms passed down the street, Artaban turned his face to the east and prayed, "God of truth, forgive my sin. I have said the thing that is not, to save the life of a child, and 2 of my gifts are gone. I have spent for man that which was meant for God. Shall I ever be worthy to see the face of the king?" But the woman, weeping for joy behind him, said gently, "May the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee, and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace." The way of sorrow. Then again there was a silence in the hall of dreams, and I understood that under the deep, mysterious stillness the years of Artaban were flowing swiftly. I caught only a glimpse, here and there, of him moving among the throngs in populous Egypt, seeking everywhere for signs of the household that had come down from Bethlehem. He found traces under the spreading sycamores of Heliopolis, and beneath the walls of New Babylon beside the Nile, but traces so faint and dim they vanished before him continually, as footprints on the hard river sand glisten for a moment with moisture, and then disappear. I saw him again at the foot of the pyramids, monuments of the perishable glory and imperishable hope of man. He looked up into the vast countenance of the crouching Sphinx, and tried to read the meaning of that inscrutable smile. Was it, indeed, the mockery of all effort and aspiration, the cruel jest of a search that can never succeed? Or was there a touch of encouragement, a promise that even the defeated should attain a victory, the blind see, and the wandering enter the haven at last? I saw him again in an obscure house of Alexandria, taking counsel with a Hebrew rabbi. The venerable man, bending over the rolls of parchment, read aloud prophecies which foretold the sufferings of the promised Messiah, despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows. "And remember, my son," said he, fixing his deep-set eyes upon Artaban, "the king you are seeking is not to be found in a palace, not among the rich and powerful. The light for which the world is waiting is a new light, the glory that shall rise out of patient, triumphant suffering. And the kingdom which is to be established forever is a new kingdom, the royalty of perfect, unconquerable love. I do not know how this shall come to pass, or how the turbulent kings and peoples of earth shall be brought to acknowledge this Messiah. But this I know, those who seek him will do well to look among the poor and lowly, the sorrowful and oppressed." I saw the other wise man traveling and searching among the people of the dispersion, with whom the family from Bethlehem might perhaps have found refuge. He passed through countries where famine lay heavy. He made his dwelling in plague-stricken cities where the sick languished in misery. He visited the oppressed in the gloom of subterranean prisons, the crowded wretchedness of slave markets, the weary toil of galley ships. In all this populous and intricate world of anguish, though he found none to worship, he found many to help. He fed the hungry, healed the sick, and comforted the captive. And his years went by more swiftly than the weaver's shuttle that flashes back and forth through the loom while the invisible pattern is completed. It seemed almost as if he had forgotten his quest. But once I saw him for a moment as he stood alone at sunrise, waiting at the gate of a Roman prison. He had taken from a secret resting place in his bosom the pearl, the last of his jewels. As he looked at it, a mellower luster, full of shifting gleams of azure and rose, trembled upon its surface. It seemed to have absorbed some reflection of the colors of the lost sapphire and ruby. So the profound, secret purpose of a noble life draws into itself the memories of past joy and past sorrow, all transfused by a subtle magic into its very essence. It becomes more luminous and precious the longer it is carried close to the warmth of the beating heart. Then, at last, while I was thinking of this pearl and its meaning, I heard the end of the story of the other wise man. A pearl of great price. 33 years of Artaban's quest had passed, and his hair, once darker than the cliffs of Zagros, was now white as the wintry snow. His eyes, that once flashed like flames of fire, were as embers smoldering among the ashes. Worn and weary and ready to die, but still a pilgrim looking for the king, he had come to Jerusalem. He had often searched the holy city before, without finding any trace of the family who had fled from Bethlehem long ago. But now it seemed as if he must make one more effort. The children of Israel, scattered in far lands all over the world, had returned to the temple for the great feast of the Passover. The city was thronged with strangers, and on this day there was a singular agitation. The sky was veiled with a portentous gloom. The currents of excitement seemed to flash through the crowd. The clatter of sandals and the soft, thick sound of thousands of bare feet shuffling over the stones flowed unceasingly along the street leading to the Damascus gate. Seeing a group from his own country, Parthian Jews, Artaban inquired where they were going. "To the place called Golgotha, outside the city walls," they answered. "Have you not heard? 2 famous robbers are to be crucified, and with them a man called Jesus of Nazareth, who has done many wonderful works among the people. But the priests and elders say he must die, because he gave himself out to be the Son of God. And Pilate has sent him to the cross, because he said he was the King of the Jews." How strangely these familiar words fell upon the tired heart of Artaban. They had led him for a lifetime over land and sea. Could it be the same at whose birth the star had appeared in heaven, and of whose coming the prophets had spoken? Artaban's heart beat excitedly. "The ways of God are stranger than the thoughts of men," he said within himself. "It may be that I shall find the king at last, and shall come in time to offer my pearl for his ransom before he dies." So the old man followed the multitude toward the Damascus gate. Just beyond the entrance of the guardhouse, a troop of soldiers came down the street, dragging a young girl with a torn dress. As the Magian paused, she saw his white cap and the winged circle on his breast, and broke from the hands of her tormentors to throw herself at his feet. "Have pity," she cried, "and save me for the sake of the God of purity. My father was a merchant of Parthia, but he is dead, and I am seized for his debts to be sold as a slave. Save me!" Artaban trembled. It was the old conflict in his soul between faith's expectation and love's impulse. Twice the gift he had consecrated to religion had been drawn from his hand to the service of humanity. This was the third trial, the final choice. Was it his great opportunity or his last temptation? He could not tell. One thing only was sure. To rescue this helpless girl would be a true deed of love. And is not love the light of the soul? He took the pearl from his bosom. Never had it seemed so luminous, so full of tender, living luster. He laid it in the slave girl's hand. This is thy ransom, daughter. The last of my treasures I kept for the king. While he spoke, the darkness thickened and the earth heaved convulsively. House walls rocked, stones crashed into the street, dust clouds filled the air. The soldiers fled in terror, but Artaban and the girl crouched beneath the wall of the praetorium. What had he to fear, or to live for? He had parted with the last hope of finding the king. The quest was over, and it had failed. But even in that thought, accepted and embraced, there was peace. He knew all was well, because he had done the best that he could from day to day. He had been true to the light given to him. He had looked for more, and if he had not found it, if failure was all, doubtless that was the best that was possible. If he could live his life over again, it could not be otherwise. One more lingering pulsation of the earthquake, and a heavy tile, shaken from the roof, fell and struck the old man on the temple. He lay, with his gray head resting on the girl's shoulder, the blood trickling from the wound. As she bent over him, there came a voice through the twilight, like music sounding from a distance. The old man's lips moved, as if in answer, and she heard him say in the Parthian tongue, "Not so, my lord, for when saw I thee hungry and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw I thee sick or in prison and came unto thee? 33 years have I looked for thee, but I have never seen thy face, nor ministered to thee, my king." He ceased, and the voice came again, very faintly. But now it seemed the maid too understood the words. "Verily I say unto thee, inasmuch as thou hast done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, thou hast done it unto me." A calm radiance of wonder and joy lighted the pale face of Artaban like the first rays of dawn. One long last breath of relief exhaled gently from his lips. His journey was ended. His treasures were accepted. The other wise man had found the king.